Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Patient First podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bryan Laskin, and as always, I'm really excited that you're here. And we have a great guest today, Ian McNickle, who's co-founder and CEO of Icon Dental Partners. Ian has over a decade of experience in dental marketing as a co-founder of WEO Media, an award-winning national dental marketing agency, and served as president of the DSO Project, a national DSO consulting firm. An author on dental practice growth strategies and a 5-time Dentistry Today top CE leader, Ian combines his engineering and business background to drive innovation in the dental field. Ian, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
No, thanks for having me, Brian. I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. So what we're going to be talking about today, I think, is of great interest to a lot of people in the industry, whether
Yeah.
you're on the leading a DSO side or whether you're a dental practice. This has come up quite a bit on the podcast before, that every DSO, every group practice is organized differently, have different values, do things differently. And I know a little bit about Icon, but first off, I want to ask you, there is this sort of designation between a DSO and a DPO. So can you talk a little bit about, in the context of the broader DSO market, and then how it relates to Icon, how you see those differences?
Yeah, absolutely. So DSO has been around really since the 90s, Heartland, and even back beyond that. They've been around a very long time. And the DSO structure is typically that of shared ownership. And then the support team is providing a full suite of non-clinical services, right? Dental partnership organization has a lot of the same characteristics. There's shared ownership between doctors and management and investors if you have investors. The difference, though, I think lies in really the structure of how the relationships work. DPO, the doctors tend to have far more autonomy, typically more ownership, a lot more say in what's going on. It's more of a true partnership approach as opposed to more of a corporate top-down command and control, which is how a lot of the older DSOs are structured. The DPO model is far more appealing for doctors, I have found. That's why one of the reasons we built Icon in that fashion.
I'm going to talk a little bit from my personal experience, because I sold my practices to a DSO, and
Yeah.
having talked, and also I'm very much in the startup space in dental technology, right?
Nice.
And every technology company that I've created, I've self-funded, and I've been on the other side, on the venture capital funded side, and actively involved on that in dentistry. And when I look at funding I'll get around to the question, but like when I look
Yeah.
at funding in the dental software side, let's face it, if you get funding, you can probably go faster, and you can do some things
Sure.
that you wouldn't be able to do. We have to do things differently because we haven't raised $50 million to like blanket market.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
see that on a DSO space personally. What I've seen is that there's because of the desire to cut costs and then sell to the next buyer, there's some perverse incentives. And I don't say that as a blanket opinion, but it's certainly my experience and me seeing what's been going on in the DSO space. So you mentioned we had a short conversation before where you said Icon doesn't have funding right now. And I think that, in my mind, that from anybody who's in Icon, it actually it removes those perverse incentives. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. I wouldn't say that we don't have funding. We're funded, but we don't have investors is how I characterize that. So we chose to work with banks to do our financing, and having control of the ownership piece, that gives us tremendous flexibility to really innovate the model and make it much more friendly for doctors. But yeah, I understand what you're saying.
And yeah, thanks for the clarification. Obviously, you have money or you would be stuck. But like, let's unpack this a little bit, because
Yeah.
I was chief innovation officer at a DSO. And what I
Mhm.
found, what that meant is that I was on a committee, not leading the committee. And wasn't exactly focused on, let's make investments that then lead to outcomes that then will have growth. It was more just like,
Right.
how can we cut costs?
Yeah.
Which in my mind, absolutely, absolutely valuable, but it's a very different business model, right? And so, how do you see that translating to Icon? Can you be, or do you lean into it and are more innovative focused versus, or like you stated, more up to the dentist and that existing practice?
So what's interesting is if you look at individual practices, there's a huge range in profitability and just how well a private practice is run. Me and our finance team, I've literally done EBITDA analyses, deep dive financial analyses on probably over 300 practices at this point over the last 5 years. So I have a pretty good feel for margins and what's out there. And honestly, like we've seen practices 0, 2, 3, 5% margins, and others are like 30, 35, even 40% in rare cases. So there's a massive range in private practice performance. And so part of our contention is if you partner with really good practices that are already profitable, or at least are open to being coached to get to be profitable, then you don't need to do all these draconian cost cutting and just bottom line spreadsheet management approaches. You really don't. It's much better if you empower the doctors with technology, with training, helping them remain fully staffed. If you can really operate from more of an abundance mentality, you can have a much more profitable practice. And that's the irony of the thing is a lot of these DSOs, when they have investors, are spreadsheet people, they're finance people. The vast majority of them have never run a business, don't have operating experience. And so they tend to look at it like, what do they know? They know spreadsheets, they know cutting costs. And so that's where they try to drive people, which sounds like your experience. A much, much smarter way to build a business is to focus on delivering value to your customers, in our case, our patients and our doctors. If you do that, you can have a tremendously profitable. Our profit margins are well above industry averages, and we don't do any cost cutting. It's all about optimizing the practices, growing the revenue, empowering the doctors to do the type of dentistry they want to do, utilizing good technology. There's so many things you can do to optimize practice profitability that have nothing to do with cutting costs or cutting corners or restricting their clinical choices. So it's really just a philosophical difference. And we've been very successful with the model.
That sounds great. So what I have seen is that when you look at a typical corporate DSO, so we're not talking about like a couple practices, but a very large organization. Oftentimes, and this is a bit of a overstatement, but generally speaking, the larger groups, just due to their size, it makes it more difficult to implement anything. So some new technology, let's say there's a new AI tool that you want to implement, rolling that out over thousands of people or tens of offices or hundreds of offices, it obviously is harder to do in a large organization than if you have a single practice with 12 people, let's say.
Sure.
But the irony is that because the larger groups see dentistry as a way to connect directly with a consumer and deliver a patient experience, they may be more inclined to incorporate technology or tools, but they have more of a challenge implementing it. But the smaller practices are less inclined to implement it, but they probably have best capability to do that. And so part of what I would see as an advantage of like the Icon model is you get the blend of both. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. So we really empowered the doctors to our doctors have 100% control over all clinical decision making, right? So which services they want to provide, which labs they use, which supplies, which equipment. Obviously, we would like to take advantage of synergies where they are, but we don't force them into that. So what we really do is think of it like a giant study club. We're a multi-specialty groups. We have specialists, we have general dentists, and it's really getting the doctors together, helping them collaborate and putting systems and processes in place to help them come to a conclusion themselves. Hey, what's the best approach for this supplier, this process, or this equipment, or whatever? There's all kinds of AI technologies coming out, right? So having the doctors vet that stuff, and then once they have buy-in, then on our support team side, we can help facilitate the implementation of those things. That 1-2 punch is really powerful. And we're a mid-sized group. We're not small, tiny. We're not huge. We're in that mid-sized range. So we're still nimble enough to really be able to take advantage of a lot of the emerging technologies and things that are happening, but do it in such a way that execution is still not really difficult. Yeah, but you got these giant groups that are out there. My gosh, that would be really difficult to implement these things. And I don't envy those folks. Hats off to them. Maybe we'll be that someday. I don't know, but I don't have that concern right now, thankfully.
And what I've seen too is that some of the largest ones are excellent at it, and some of the smaller ones are horrible at it. So it really doesn't come down to the size; it comes down to how well you're organized, right? And so let's talk about that a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, you're right. Yeah, it comes down to what's the skill set of the management team, the leadership team? Do they have an execution approach? Do they have systems in place for project management and goal setting and all that kind of thing? And we're pretty organized in that side of things, so it helps us. But you're right. some of these bigger groups, because they've been around 10, 15, 20 years, they've had time to really get some great systems in place. And so that is one of the advantages that larger groups can have, is just experience and time to optimize. The downside that they have is they tend to be much more corporate. And this is true. I don't want to pick on big DSOs, but just any big business, the bigger you get, the more corporate it is, the more there's bureaucracy of layers of decision making. And that's just the nature of big companies. I like operating in the middle sized company space. You get the best of both worlds. It's that Goldilocks scenario. And eventually, yeah, maybe 10 years from now, we will be a big giant company too, but I guess I'll worry about that 10 years from now.
I've found that the difference between the organizations, even more so than the size. And now, because I do a lot of entrepreneurial endeavors outside or tangential to dentistry, and I certainly become part of a lot of different entrepreneurial communities. And regardless of size, it really comes down to this. You mentioned it, the strength of the leadership is if you're going to lead by committee, and I don't mean that one person has a dictatorial say, but if you have an aligned, let's say, leadership team where that's strong, and there's one or two strong leaders, it goes a long way down, even in a large organization, to that, from the CEO down to the dental assistant, down to whoever's cleaning the office when it ends. And I see in dentistry not in every organization, but as a whole, a massive leadership void. And that's where I think this stuff kind of drops. So I think it sounds, and from my experience, and I know a couple people at Icon who I think very highly of. And so what are you doing as leader of Icon to keep that party rocking in the right direction?
Yeah, a lot of DSOs are started by doctors and they don't have a lot of kind of management or leadership experience. And so they take it as far as they can. They get up to 5, 10 locations. And then typically you get investors come on and they start hiring managers, and it's just piecemeal, build it on the fly approach. Icon was a really different origin story. I've been an entrepreneur for 18 years. My background is mechanical engineering. I worked in the high-tech industry and semiconductors manufacturing for 10 years. So extremely process-oriented, organized management skills. It was drilled into us. So I did high-tech for 10 years. Towards the end of that, I got my MBA at the University of Washington. And so I'm really a business/engineer mindset. So I've been building and running companies for a long time. And then as we started designing Icon, we really took a kind of a whiteboard approach. I literally interviewed over 200 doctors over the course of 18 months doing initial research and recruiting processes. And I just asked them stuff like, hey, what are you looking for in a group? What would appeal to you? And then what horror stories have you heard? And so as we started understanding what are the real things we need to design into our business model, then before I started recruiting doctors, I started building my management team. And I was really seeking people that absolutely knew dental experience, had a lot of dental experience, and preferably optimization of practices, but really looking for people who were aligned with us in terms of doing dentistry the right way for the right reasons. And so we've built a really strong team. Our C-suite is like top notch. I'd put them against any C-suite out there. Absolutely. And our VPs, our directors, for a small company, we've got over 300 years of dental management experience on our exec team. It's really strong. And so a lot of us have experience in other areas as well. So we bring not just dental industry experience, but a lot of us have experience outside of the industry. And so bringing that all together has allowed us to really, I would say, implement a lot of best practices for management and leadership development. And it's really helping. We've built this infrastructure that can scale us to hundreds of locations, no problem.
That's great. And fun fact, I also started my college career in mechanical engineering, and it took me less than a semester to realize that my ADD was going to point me in a different direction. That's cool. But so what brought you to dentistry? I'm curious because it sounds that's a big transition from your past life.
It's a huge transition. Yeah. So like I said, after about 10 years in high tech, I got an MBA towards the end of that time, and I decided I really wanted to be in business for myself. So I just basically quit my job cold turkey. I wasn't laid off or anything. I just said, I'm just going to quit and go for it. And so I quit my job. I started a local regional business and marketing consulting firm back in 2006 or 7, and convinced my roommate from grad school, Corey Roletto, convinced him to quit Intel. He was a chemical engineer MBA, and he quit Intel, and the two of us founded this little company. And then we did that for a few years. And then in 2009, we met another guy, Mark, and he had a website company. And so the three of us got together and we co-founded WEO Media in 2009. And so That company originally was just based in the Northwest, focusing on small businesses for digital marketing and stuff like that. And then in probably late 2010, early 2011, we formed a partnership with some dental companies in the Northwest. And probably, I would say midway through 2011, we made the decision, hey, let's just focus on one industry. Let's just do a deep dive, get really good at one industry. And we thought dental made a ton of sense for a number of reasons. And so we backed into it just inadvertently through some partnerships. But I'm really thankful that we chose dental because it's been a great industry for us. But that's how I came here, was just through a little bit of a circuitous route. But we got here.
That's really cool. Yeah, well, I'm glad that you're here. And I think that when we doing the research, interviewing 200 dentists, talking to them about corporate dentistry versus kind of what they were looking at addressing, what are those gaps that you see when a dentist is thinking, the dentist that might be listening to this podcast thinking, I don't know about these groups and that it's very corporate. How do you view corporate dentistry versus the opportunities outside of corporate?
Yeah, a lot of the things that popped up in our research, we innovated and built into the model. And so when we launched Icon, we had a couple dozen doctors who really helped us design the model, and they joined us as essentially our fellow co-founders. So in a sense, Jeremy and I are the co-founders, but really it's more, 30 or 40 co-founders, really is how I think about it. We built things into the model that were specifically what they wanted. And so obviously clinical autonomy we talked about. So it's really clear in our legal documentation that they have full clinical and that can't be changed, control over that stuff. Same thing with practice staffing. It's pretty common in groups when you join a group. This is one of the big reasons doctors get ticked off with corporate groups is the corporate groups have control over the practice staffing a lot of times. And so they'll come in and make changes like to the office manager or this person or that person, and it destroys the culture in the practice. It erodes the trust. So again, we built into our model, clear in the legal documents, doctors have full control over all practice staffing, hiring, firing, setting up pay, setting up benefits, all that stuff. A bunch of other things too, just to not to turn this into a big dissertation, but one of the kind of common things that a lot of groups will do is they'll have different levels of shares or stock. And the reason for that is that, you give doctors a little bit lower levels of stock, maybe some holding company and some regional or practice level stock. And the reason investors typically do that is it maximizes the return at the shareholder company level, the holding company level, and diminishes the returns for the doctors. And so we set up one category of shares. It's just holding company shares for all of our doctors. And in a traditional group where you've got an investor, investors would usually own half the company. Doctors maybe own 40% and management would own 10%. That's pretty typical for a lot of groups, plus or minus a little bit. Since we decided not to use investors, at least for the foreseeable future, we basically gave that 50% that would have gone to investors, we give to the doctors. So the doctors own 90% of Icon. I was fully in control of the company, but I decided, hey, we want to truly make this a doctor-led, doctor-owned organization. So we gave them 90% ownership at the holding company, and we put them in control of the board. So our board of directors has 5 people on it. It's me and 4 doctors. And so the doctors have control of the board. So all of our decision-making runs through that filter of the doctors. What's good for clinical, what's good for patients and practices. And we do there's a bunch of other stuff. I could talk to you for an hour easily about all the things we built into our model that are pretty unique and our doctors love it. But it's at the end of the day, doctor-led, doctor-controlled, doctor-majority owned. Like when you're set up that way, you can do tremendous things with your business model that investor-backed groups typically won't do or can't do.
That's great. And one of my predictions, so I do predictions now every year, and my predictions for 2024 I probably a little bit early, so I'll probably carry it on to 2025, is that with the cost of capital being expensive, I see DSOs shifting from like cost cutting to trying to figure out how to grow practices or same store growth. Because frankly, it's a totally different business model. And so I had the prediction that the DSOs, which are, I said doctor led, but in your case, I would say having a bunch of doctors on the leadership team, let's call it, or on the board of directors are the ones that are going to win going forward. Because you just can't, dentistry is not, you obviously can save costs when you're in a group setting and economies of scale. But if we're going to focus on patients, if we're going to derive the best clinical care that's going to ultimately lead to that referral and get patients to do full mouth reconstructions or the larger cases, it's not going to come from a finance background. It's going to come from somebody who understands the actual clinical practice of dentistry. So I think that's huge and very smart for you who came from outside of dentistry to recognize that, that is, in my experience, extremely unique. So that's very cool.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been an effective model. Our organic growth, we have a pretty strong acquisition pipeline because our model is so attractive. A lot of doctors want to join us, which I love it. More the better. But we're also highly focused on organic because organic growth at the same store, like you talked about, because it's as you get bigger and bigger, that does become a bigger factor. And I don't want to, a lot of these groups, they just focus on rolling up practices, it's just an acquisition game. They don't pay as much attention to operating margins of the practice. And then you get to a certain size and you realize, oh, I can't acquire as much as I need to hit those recap numbers for my investors. And now they got to get serious about organic. We've been serious about it from day one. Our organic growth was over 20% last year, same store. That's way above industry average because we have a really strong team and a great group of docs. We're focusing on both the entire time, which makes our margins strong, our balance sheet strong, and it sets us up for tremendous future growth.
That's great. How can people go find out more information if they're interested in Icon? Where should they go?
Yeah, I'd love to chat with you. If you have any docs listening to the program today, happy to chat with them. They can go to our website. It's just Icon, I-C-O-N, icondentalpartners.com. Go to the website. There's plenty of information on there. I've actually on the Learn page, I've got about a 42-minute webinar that goes into a lot of details about our business model and some of the things that are advantageous about it. Not everything, but enough. Of course, the contact us page, they can fill out a form and that comes straight to me and my team. So yeah, I would love to chat with any docs if they're curious about how to partner. Really, we think about it in terms of like you get all the benefits of private practice, but also the benefits of a group, the economies of scale. So it's the best of both worlds and how our partnership model is designed.
Great. Go to icondentalpartners.com. Ian, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me today.